Given that Dungeons & Dragons typically requires a bit of travel, it's important to have a style for how your travel works in your game. A lot of people think they're limited to one, the other, or they just don't know where to even begin when it comes to travel. So this video is for those of you who want to know what are your options for travel, what are the pros and cons to each one, and I'm gonna give you exactly that. I'm gonna dive into it, but first let me just say this is very dependent on you, your style, and your players. A lot of people think there's a right way or a wrong way. It's Dungeons & Dragons, it's a TTRPG. There isn't. You can take any of these styles, you can adjust them, but make sure you're aware of what your players want. So one of the first questions you should ask yourself is, does distance matter in your game? Does it impact the story? Does it impact the way that you have set up your quest to involve travel time and things like that? If you don't have it, a lot of the time it can feel awkward if somebody really digs into the lore or the actual immersion of the world when it's like, oh, we only took a day to get there and we got back, how so much changed? Whereas if all of a sudden you have real distances and it takes a week to get there, 2 weeks to get there, that leaves a lot more room for things to have been happening while your party has been out in this adventure. So you can take either one. You can have it just be it doesn't really matter, or you can really get into the nitty-gritty and allow your world around these situations to flourish. Another thing that distances do is allow the world to seem vast. If you really add in that detail, and sometimes you don't even have to play it out, but just letting them know this is a 4-week travel. It took you a month to get from point A to point B. Then all of a sudden they know, wow, this world is huge. So let's say that you chose that distance does matter in your game for the benefit that I established already. Now the question goes to, is it set distances or improv distances? And there are pros and cons to both. So with set distances, the pros are of course consistency, being able to plan things better for what might happen in between, how the world can change because you know the exact time frames, and the players can know that stuff too. The cons are that it can be restrictive and it can lead to a lack of flexibility in your games because they know that it takes 3 weeks to get there and you know it takes 3 weeks to get there, but you wanted something else to happen in a week or something like that, right? So it can end up shifting things around where they wanted to get something done or the player wants to take this other quest and it just doesn't go with the time system, the travel system that you've already established. An easy way to set distances is with something like a hex grid map. That's what a lot of people do for more world map or region maps, is to make a hex grid and then set each hex to a certain thing like 1 day travel, or you can get really nitty and gritty with specific mileage. So now let's talk about the improv style of distances. The pros: it's flexible, the opposite of the restrictive for the other option, and it allows you to come up with more things for the story on the fly. So instead of having to be like, oh, this is going to be a week travel to get from here to there, I already know that because it's in the map, you can adjust things to fit the narrative that you are actively telling more freely. The cons to this are, of course, it can lead to inconsistencies. It requires you to start to remember some of these set things, and then slowly but surely it becomes more set in its ways anyway. It goes to the other model. Let's say before they headed in the left direction from the town to the west, and it took 2 days to get to this point. But now they're going to the east, same flat terrain. It looks like it's the same distance on the map, but you forgot about the 2-day travel and you tell them it's 1 or 5. And it leads to these sort of inconsistencies where it's like, well, why did it take longer to get there or here? And of course you can make that stuff up as you go. Maybe your players don't care at all, but this is just one of the downsides to making improv travel instead of set travel. So now let's assume you've decided whether or not you're going to do set or improv. What's next? Now we talk about the style, and that is, are you going to do the day-by-day grind, which we're going to call the grind mode, or are you going to do the jump mode, where you simply go from, hey, you guys have been traveling, okay, 2 days in, this happens, or you go all the way to the end. A week goes by, everything's fine, you arrive at your destination. The opposite, the grind mode, is what we're going to start with first. So the grind mode is definitely going to be something that is for the very specific audience, the niche audience, I would say, that wants to have to worry about resource management. They want to know how many rations they have, how much food do they have for the horses if they have them, and everything in between. They want there to be the possibility that every day of travel something could happen. There could be an RNG encounter. They want to roll on tables perhaps, or the DM just has it all planned out, but it is the very, very nitty-gritty style where every day you have to play. The pros to this is that it can be very detailed. It can add more immersion to your world and make it seem more like they're really in the adventure if that's what they're looking for. In addition, those players who want to really really role play these scenarios will get those opportunities. The cons to this are, of course, that you end up getting a potentially monotonous experience. It puts a lot more pressure on you, the DM, to make these times exciting, and it can slow down the game. Next up, we have the jump mode. This is going to be where you do just jump to either random points throughout, or you can go the full distance and just say you arrive at your destination. So I have started to do more of the jump mode, but with the stops in between. You have to find ways to kind of fit them in a way that feels natural versus, okay, it's nightfall on day 2, roll initiative, and then you just throw a monster at them. So try to flesh that out if that's your style, but that's what I tend to do. So it might be like, okay, because I have a large world that I homebrewed, I will say, you know, this is a 7-day trip. They'll head out. I'll say, okay, the first day went by uneventfully as you're still kind of in the safety of the region's guards and things like that from the city that you're leaving. Not as many beasts and creatures tend to dwell near the settlement, but the further out you go, the more likely. So you travel in a certain area of the world, and it might be like, okay, on the morning of day 3, as you're just getting started, you hear a crunching sound nearing the camp, and then all of a sudden, bam, there's an encounter. There could be traps, there could be ambushes. You can decide whatever you want. But once that's done and they decide to leave again, if they want to add some RP or something in there, they have that opportunity. I can then go, okay, the next 3 days of your trip go by relatively uneventfully, and you, on the last night of your trip, while you're setting up camp, see a dragon flying in the distance. And then they can make decisions based on that. Do they hide? Do they fight it? I'm not forcing anything, but I am throwing some travel things in there that make the world feel more alive. You, of course, don't have to do that, and you can skip all the way to the destination, and it makes it that easy. Taking something from what we just talked about, do you want RNG encounters or do you want meticulously planned encounters? And there are, of course, pros and cons to both of these styles. So we'll start with RNG. So this, of course, just means random. Now, this could be done in grind or it can be done in planned encounters. You just say, you know what? Every single day they're gonna roll on a chart and there's going to be some sort of monster or encounter for them to have. Remember, not all encounters have to be monsters. However, the other side of this is that you could say, on the 3rd day, the 2nd day, in the 5th day, in the morning, there will be encounters, but they're going to be random. I'm not going to plan them out. The pros of this, you can surprise your players. You'll be keeping them on their toes. It's unpredictable. And of course, it's a little bit of a spice for you as well. You roll something of this is what you're going to fight. And there are tons of charts out there readily available for you to pick based on where they're at, the kind of world that you have, and everything in between. The cons to this, if you're doing it on, let's say, a day-by-day grind, is that it can break the narrative of the game. If you're not following a chart, it could, of course, throw monsters in that don't even make sense. Maybe you care about that, maybe you don't. And it may result in too many encounters or too few encounters, depending on what style you choose to utilize with it. If you're going with the every single day, you could just, of course, ask a player, you know, a 20% chance, roll a percentile die, and if it's 20% or lower, they roll on another chart and there's an encounter. That's the easiest way to do it. So now we'll talk about the meticulously planned encounters. This allows you to have way more control over what they fight, how long it might take, really plan the things out, have it maybe have impact on a greater arc that you have in your game. There are a lot of things that you can do when you are really getting into the nitty-gritty and planning these things. The cons, of course, being that it is very time consuming, meaning you have to plan all this stuff out, you have to think about it. It can be a lot. I think every DM who has done this knows that it can be a lot to get a well-balanced, meaningful encounter in your game. Another con is that it may feel scripted. Again, going back to if you just go, hey, okay, you're 1 day into your travel and now you're in encounter roll initiative. It just feels very planned. And again, depending on your group, they may love that. They may want to just get into the weeds of it. Other groups, it's going to feel very abrasive when you just jump in that way. So with this, you just have to pick the one that fits best with you and your group. That is going to be the theme of every detail here, but now we're a little bit further into it. So we'll talk briefly about strategically planning encounters within your campaign, and that's going to be with things like, again, maybe the 2nd day or the 3rd day to fill in the gaps, because on the 1st day, they're traveling out. On the 4th day, let's say they're arriving at their destination. So you make it more exciting on the middle days that way. And again, that's more when they're in the no man's land. They're not at maybe 2 different settlements or whatever it might be, or it's just a dangerous trip to a cave or a castle or something like that. So filling in the middle part may be more important. And of course, try to figure out the encounters that will fit more in where they're going, what leads up to it, and everything in between that is a part of your narrative or your world that you're using for your game. Also, don't hesitate to use your traveling as a storytelling experience. Describe the world as they pass through it if it has meaning in your game. If they need to know that the ruins they're passing by had some sort of substance in your world, and there's something there that could be beneficial to their knowledge as they move forward in your story, let them know that. Describe it to them. Let them get a little bit of that history that you've been wanting to lore dump on them. Again, if they're those types of players. If they're very much the let's go in, roll dice, fight stuff, and you spend 30 minutes telling them about the lore of the random abandoned castle they're passing by, they're not going to be engaged. And the key for most things as a DM is to keep your players engaged. So keep that in mind. And that is the best way, I think, to describe the options you have with travel. So you have to decide, does distance matter to you? Will you be using the grind style day by day or the jump style? Do you want to jump to the end? Do you want to jump to certain points throughout? All those things are up to you. Then you can decide, is it RNG encounters, things that you can just pop up, throw out a stat block and be ready to go? Or do you want to plan them so they feel maybe like they have a purpose in your game and you can make sure they're more balanced? You can pick any of these things. So just make sure you pick the one that works best for you and your group. If you want more content just like this, please consider leaving a comment, clicking the bell so you get notifications, subscribing to the channel, and of course, giving the video a thumbs up. You can also find free content and paid content over on Patreon. Patreon.com/levelupdm. It will be linked down below. And if you want to support me directly here on YouTube, become a member on the channel. Thank you guys so much. And until next time, good luck in your adventures.